Hey, good morning, everyone. Welcome to Lookout live stream. Today is the 1st of September, 2023, and we're waking up in Chico to light sprinkles. It's about 75% humidity out. Last night was cloudy all over the West Coast, and so we didn't really get any new infrared, no intel really to share with you. So we're not going to do a big operational update today. We're going to talk about fire effects. And what I was realizing just recently is this has kind of turned into more of a lecture than a fire intel report, which I like. And so I'm trying to kind of think, it's like, well, if this is a lecture, then kind of need a syllabus. And this can be a YouTube class for y'all. So just kind of noodling on that, figure out how that's going to be organized and how we're going to put it together and how we can kind of use all the stuff we've already done. So we're going to call this kind of lesson number 1. So if you're just tuning into lesson number 1, recommend going back and looking at our coverage over the last 2 weeks of the Northwest California lightning fires, because there's a lot of little tidbits in there in this lecture series, and you kind of get to see as the fire progresses how what we're talking about is coming to happen. So at some point we might mix that all into something more digestible, but for now, if you're interested in, if you're just picking this up, recommend going back and looking at the last 2 weeks of our reporting on Northwest California and Oregon fires, and kind of moving forward, want to treat this a little more organized as kind of a more of a kind of educational series. We're still definitely focused on giving people current fire information, but we want to kind of organize the non-tactical stuff a little bit better and give you guys a better idea of what you're going to encounter as we go through these things. So as I just said, we don't have a lot of new intel this morning because it's super cloudy and only one fire on the West Coast, or at least of the fires we're covering, got flown last night. So we're not going to do the full-on blow by blow of everything that's new, because a lot of these fires are pretty much behaving themselves as far as we know, and we don't have really good intel otherwise. But what I want to talk about today is what we've seen from the effects of the fires that we've had so far, and talk a little bit about how we assess fire effects, the tools that are available to us. As I'm talking to you, I'm waiting for my computer to slowly load an image of the Perch fire. But I think we'll jump into talking about fire effects, fire severity. I think one of the big messages of these big fires is that they're not all devastation. And I would think oftentimes the media gets a hold of an acreage number and they say 50,000 acres have been devastated by fires in northwestern California so far. And that's almost never true. There's been some studies that have been done on fires in northwestern California back in kind of up to the mid-2000s, and they found that 70% of the acreage burned during these major lightning fires burns at low to moderate, or what we'd call beneficial severity. So what we're going to do today is we're going to talk a bit about how we map severity. I've got some images here that I'm pulling down that were captured day before yesterday that show kind of where we've got living and dead vegetation. And so we'll pull those up and talk about them a little bit. As we kind of mentioned a little before, we use a satellite called the Sentinel satellite to do a lot of this stuff. And it's run by the European Space Agency, and the imagery is free. And it's great stuff. So, but this morning, it's slow. Getting this stuff off the satellite is slow. So, to bear with me while we download it. But I've got some queued up here, so we'll jump into it. So you've probably seen me show this kind of imagery before. This is basically what the satellites do is they scan the landscape kind of like a digital camera, but they have, where your camera picks up red, green, and blue light. These satellites pick up more like 10 bands of light, and we know that light radiation, only a portion of it occurs in like the spectrum that we can see with our eyeballs. But there's infrared light, there's ultraviolet light, and kind of in between there's the visible light we can see. So what these satellites do is they scan these other bands, and including the thermal. Heat is also kind of a light wave. So what we can do is we can take the different bands and we can throw them into the red, green, and blue channels of our computer and create a visualization. So this visualization uses what's called SWIR, or shortwave infrared, and what that is picking up on is kind of the radiation radiated by plants. And so plants absorb a lot of light energy for photosynthesis. If there's no plants, then a lot of light doesn't get absorbed. So these images, the red shows places, we're on the river complex here, Smith River Complex. Red is places where it's kind of bare dirt, black sticks, no tree canopy. So we're just starting off up by O'Brien, and this imagery kind of, because it's thermal, it picks up kind of interesting things about what was going on at that snapshot in time. This satellite goes over every 5 days at noon. It's set up on an orbit, so it goes over. It's always passing over noon wherever noon is on the planet, which is great because if you want to look at satellite scenes from day to day, you can compare the same amount of light. The shadows are in the same place, etc. So every 5 days we get Sentinel. Sentinel's great, especially if it goes over when your fire happens to be active. So here we can see that this is where the firing comes down to the road that I forget every single time and have to zoom in, and then Google tells me Low Mountain Road, and I've heard like 10 different names from people for this particular road. But anyway, they brought fire down almost a week ago down Dozier Line to Low Mountain Road, and then the last couple of days they started firing Dozier Line headed up to the northwest. And so this image captures that firing kind of midstream. You can see at noon they had this amount of fire on the ground. This was the day that we got our strong north winds. So what happened here was in the afternoon 2 days ago, this firing kind of burned in a big chunk of this area here. And then it also filled in this chunk here. And so with the winds we had and everything, I expect that there's going to be a pretty good high severity patch filling in this gap that hadn't burned yet. But what we see as we move kind of south down towards 199 is the white line here is the fire perimeter as it was mapped night before last. And you can see that along 199 here, the fire backed in, and there's a ton of trees that are still green along, kind of west of Idlewild. Over here, burning out towards the Slater fire, you can see that most of the burn out here on the east side of 199, a lot of it got underburned, and there's still a ton of green trees. Here on Patrick Creek, there's been a lot of people asking about the Patrick Creek Lodge, and other people have better intel on what's happening there. I don't know. But you can see a mix. The fire on the ridges burned a higher severity, and in the bottoms it kind of backed in. So a lot of this drainage here on the 316 road also burned with a low severity. So what happens is we see patches of high severity when the fire, weather, and topography come together. So we had big runs on this fire in Stony Creek that ran 3.5 miles, kind of where the winds were aligned with the topography. And you can see there that it was a high severity burn. Another thing that affects severity is what the condition was before the fire. Was it a brush field? Was it a thicket? Was it old growth? So those things matter. Also, this on this fire here, the Kelly fire, the big run that we got on the same day that Stony Creek ran also burned with high severity. Since then, the fire hasn't moved as much on this, and you can see in the time basically since that big run happened, over the course of about a week, the fire backed down here, down towards the 427 road, and you've gotten a whole bunch of kind of beneficial fire severity. Over here we can see the firing operations that they were doing to bring fire down the 405 road. Some of this got burned hot later in the same day, and we had kind of a spot out into here. You can see that the coon fire here, also most of it to this point burned with a lower to moderate severity, and there's still a lot of green trees. Here we've been talking about how they're using drones to bring the fire down into the canyon. And it's too hard to tell with the smoke here, like how well that is affecting the severity. The areas, there, it looks like there was quite a bit of heat from that drone operation. But here, this is kind of, this is a great illustration, seeing the heat of kind of your classic backing fire, where the fire just, you've got this active fire flaming front that's maybe, 50 yards across, if that. Sometimes it's only 5 feet across or 2 feet across. Slowly backing down the mountain, and you can see how that, potentially in these areas where there's not a lot of concentrated heat could give you these beneficial fire effects. So we're talking a little bit about how pre-existing conditions affect how severe a fire is. And so we can see that a lot of the places that burned with lower severity had bigger trees there before. So there's more shade, there's more moisture held there. And you can see that a lot of these patches where you had high severity were either old burns, brush, small timber. And at some of these places where we had the highest severity runs, like in Stony Creek, let's see. There was a lot of brush and small trees. So that matters because I think, when you look at this and you see this high proportion of red, you're like, oh man, the forest got devastated. And sometimes it was like, well, that was already brush. And it didn't necessarily, like, say, nuke the old growth or the bigger remaining trees. And you can see down in the bottom here where you've got some larger trees, you've got more green left. So when we look at severity, we always need to kind of parse it by the vegetation type that was there before. Because you can say, well, this fire burned with, 50% or 60% was high severity. It's like, okay, well, and of that, 80% was brush before the fire. So I think it's just important to try to come to understand what affects how and why we get these patches of severity. And one thing that patches of high severity give us are an opportunity where there's reduced fuels to say, come in here in a few years and put prescribed fire on the ground to clean up trees that were killed by this fire. So I'm not pretending to say that, that we can feel good about all this, because often what we're seeing when we have high severity in an area that was already brush is that a lot of these fires we're in the process of type converting a lot of our forests from forests to brush and scrub. And that is what it is. A lot of these places that have burned hot now aren't going to come back as forest in our lifetimes. But I think it's good to just to be able to look at these images and say, it's easy to say like, oh, fire's good, lightning fires are good, they're mainly beneficial or whatever. But I think being able to talk about where we get the effects that we like out of them and where we get the effects that we don't like, it's important because then we can get an idea of like, well, what were the conditions here before the fire? And how did different kind of landscape management histories affect this? Are there areas where we logged heavily and left a lot of slash that burned hot? Or are there areas that we logged heavily, 40 years ago and planted a bunch of trees and then didn't treat them? Did those burn hotter? We need all the clues we can get in figuring out what we've done wrong with forestry and land management and what is working out for us. Because as we've said many times on the show, when it comes down to it, the capacity of the Forest Service to really affect vegetation management on the scale of the ownership that they have it's pretty, what we'd say, pinner, right? And one example, I think, of that is just of how we're chasing our tails with that is talking to a friend of mine whose job is to kind of help the Forest Service get work done. all the timber staff that were supposed to be getting up to speed with some big projects over here on this district to improve fire resiliency, thinning, and other kind of timber harvest that could have beneficial effects, they're all tied up managing the fire. You know, they're out as resource advisors, everything else. And so this forest is pretty much this district is ground to a halt on any sort of project work because everyone's just dealing with the emergency. And so we've got these narrow windows sometimes to get work done. And then we can spend, this fire potentially is going to be tying those folks up through the end of the fall. And so when do we get the good work done? It's like, it's not happening. We got projects that got burned on the Dixie Fire that had been in planning since the Story Fire in the year 2000. So like it or not, fire is kind of doing the heavy lifting of managing our landscapes. And so I think the sooner we come to understand how it works, what it's doing, and getting all right with the scale at which it operates, the sooner we can kind of get our heads wrapped around that, the better. So I got another image here, hopefully. Looks like. Yes, came through. Okay, so we're going to jump in here and look at the perch fire. And then real quick while that's happening, I need to queue up the next one because they're taking a long time to get down here. Let's look at mosquito. Nothing more fun than watching someone else drive a computer, huh? So here, looking at perch, here's Orleans. Here's the perch fire. For some reason I don't have the perimeter turned on for this one, but you can see the firing operation on perch came down Antenna Ridge. You can actually see the hand line on here, and they've brought fire down through here. You can see that we had some kind of slope-driven runs where you get that combination of fire burning up the slope with some wind on it, where the top of the mountain is kind of now bald. But we can also see that where the fire's been backing here, it's the same thing we're seeing elsewhere. The backing fire is largely leaving the big trees intact. And a lot of this now has had fire kind of backing down into it. It sounds like they were going to resume firing on this portion of perch yesterday, but it's hard to tell with what we've got going with the weather if that firing is actually going to carry. And so I wanted to do a little quick live demo here. I encourage everyone to play with fire in a safe environment. But I have to find my lighter. So I got some grass from my backyard. It's 75% humidity out in my backyard right now. And I just wanted to show you that I got this grass. And if I light it, it burns and it just goes out. And that's what we call kind of the moisture of extinction. When we do prescribe burns, we look at what's called the probability of ignition. And so, I showed some models the other day, and man, if anyone comes in here right now, they're going to think that I'm smoking out. It smells like burning weed. Burning weeds in the lookout. Moisture of extinction. So we got these fuels. Moisture extinction is the kind of fuel moisture at which the material can't burn. And so when we do prescribe burns, we're developing, the prescription is the humidity and the temperature and the wind speed that we want to burn at to make sure we get the effects we want. And a lot of that is based around being able to control the fire. So we can take the fuel moisture, the temperature, and kind of where we are on the slope, and we can calculate what we call probability of ignition. And the probability of ignition is if I throw 100 matches out on the landscape, how many of them are going to become fires? How many of them are going to spread on their own? So right now, the probability of ignition in my backyard per our experiment just now and per the numbers is like, 10%. Maybe if it lands at the base of the biggest clump of grass that's had a little sun on it this morning, maybe that'll burn, maybe 5%. So when we do burns, oftentimes we look at like, okay, maybe we'll aim for a 70% probability of ignition, meaning that it's not likely we're going to torch up trees. And if we do, it's not super likely that those spot fires, those embers that go over the line, are going to start a new fire. So as we can see, looking at our weather conditions across, say, where are we at here? Right now we got 83% humidity out here in the Siskiyou Wilderness. We've got 86. We got 98 in Gasky, 95. That's wet. That's dripping wet. Some places over here in the Redwoods, we got 100% humidity. We've got 90% humidity over in Wairika, which is basically a desert. We got temperatures in the like 40s to 60s. So our probability of ignition out there right now is like, 5%. Not good if you're trying to do a backfire. Oh, sorry, I got to share my screen, huh? Well, you can take my word for it. I'm not making up the weather. So that's one reason that these fires didn't blow up the other day. When we looked at over in Gasky, we saw these fires really ran hard for a couple hours on the webcams, and they were surely throwing embers all over the place. But those embers were landing in a fuel bed that was not receptive, and so they didn't become other large fires. During the Dixie fire, we had days at a time where our probability of ignition was 100%. And so these models are looking at like, okay, you're going to have a fire, it's going to torch up, and it's going to throw out a bunch of embers, and those embers are going to start new fires. And that's kind of one of the mechanisms that spreads fire quickly when we have severe conditions. But right now, even though we had north winds and the humidity came down for a few hours, any embers, the fire could only move as fast as it could move, kind of branch to branch, tree to tree. What really spreads our big, explosive, scary fire growth is long-range spotting. And that's how the barrack fire could run 40 miles in an afternoon, is it was spotting a mile, 2 miles ahead of it. And so it just moves as like a bunch of independent fires that grow together. So back to our severity map here. And I won't forget to switch my screen. As we said earlier, just firing operations are the tool we have to contain these large fires. And right now, we don't have that tool. So kind of a worst case scenario for right now is that we'd suddenly, out of the blue, and I don't expect it to happen, get this like 2-week intense drying trend where we went up to 90 degrees every day and we got down, the humidities got low. Because at some point, we're going to get a wind event and fires are going to want to spread. So if we stay moist and then don't have an opportunity to get the firing actually done, or we put fire on the ground, just kind of skunks around, and then now we've got more fire on the ground but not complete consumption of the fuels, that's bad news. So the rain's helping firefighters for sure, but the one drawback is that it makes it hard to do firing. So to come over here and look at mosquito before the wind event, as we've been mentioning on mosquito, they've kind of been working hard to tie in these road systems. And let me see real quick if I can turn on the actual fire perimeter. Here we go. So once again, the white line is kind of where the fire was the night before last. And then we can see that day before yesterday, during that wind event, we saw this fire take off and start to head up this slope. And we can see where it's been backing down. It's had mixed severity, but we can see also that they fired this whole eastern flank of the fire, the northeast flank, and that all the firing that they did off the roads basically was low severity. And this fire, almost all of the backing fire did down the mountain to the north slope, was kind of beneficial fire. So overall, the mosquito, it's like, okay, we've got, maybe 30% of it burned with a high severity. And that's your classic 70% low to moderate severity fire. Starts on top of the mountain. We expect our south-facing slopes to have denser vegetation because there's less competition for light on south-facing slopes. And so the brush can grow dense and it still gets plenty of light. On the north-facing slopes, everything's competing for less light. And so the trees reach up taller and the vegetation, you don't have as much brush underneath. So oftentimes we see lower severity on north slopes. And then when it backs down the north slope, all the better. So, we do tend to see bigger patches of higher severity on the south-facing slopes that have denser vegetation, dry out quicker, and in this case, get pushed by up canyon afternoon winds. Over here on the bluff fire, you can see there's been quite a bit of heat put into the equation along this perimeter as it's been fired. But even then, a lot of that has been low to moderate severity. And, really, you don't want your firing operation to be high severity because then you get spots and embers. And so the whole idea of putting fire on the ground is to put it on the ground in such a way that you consume the ground fuel, but that you're not just torching up everything and having to chase spots down the hill all day long. So same thing here. This actually hasn't burned yet in this fire. This is the firing operation out ahead of it. But a lot of also on bluff. So everything on bluff inside this perimeter here also burned with a low to moderate severity, except these little patches. And like we said before, you come in and look at where those little patches are, and oftentimes they're a clear cut, or they're a brush field, or there's some other feature that had, let's see. So see these patches that burned hot in here. If we look at it again, it's like it's brush, it's sparse, it's open, there's no shade. And the patches that survived are the patches where there's taller trees, there's shade, there's moisture. So I think it's always interesting to look at, like, what was it about the patch that made it burn hot? It's like, yeah, well, one reason for that is that fires like to burn the same way in the same place over and over. So if you've had an area where the fire ran up the canyon and torched the upper south-facing slope, 50 years ago, it's likely it's going to do that again. So kind of same here on Mosquito. And when you look at where we had the hot burn, a lot of it's these kind of sunny-facing slopes that don't have a lot of shade. So I think one thing that is worth talking about here while we're having this conversation is kind of landscape, like conservation biology wise. There's some interesting kinds of things that this imagery does for us. And that's, if we want to look at places on the landscape where we want to try to grow large trees in the future, if we want to try to restore old growth conditions in places that have been, logged or degraded or burned with fire, we have to kind of pick those spots carefully, because if we decide that for some reason that we want this spot here to be old growth down the road, if someone just draws on a map, they're like, oh, that looks like a good spot. It's we end up, we've got the wilderness map here, and I kind of call it management by polygon. Someone might decide, hey, it's wilderness, and therefore we'll manage it XYZ way. It's like with this kind of large scale planning, oftentimes they're like, okay, there's let me gather my thoughts here. Where I'm trying to go is just to say that if you're going to try to grow, try to restore forests, you probably want to pick a spot that isn't naturally prone to high severity fire. So you don't probably want to, if you're going to do tree planting for a carbon investment, you probably don't want to fund it on an upper slope here that just burned hot. And I think oftentimes there's this rush to reforest, there's this rush to do something after a fire. And so we have the Penny Pines program. You pay a bunch of you get money, and Boy Scouts go out and they plant a bunch of trees. And we gravitate to the places that burned the hottest to go plant the trees again, because they look devastated and they look like they need to be green again. But there's a reason that place burned the hottest, and that's oftentimes that it's the top of a south-facing slope where up canyon winds are going to blow on it every day. We see that in Concow, where I live here in Chico. The landscape there is set up for these huge downslope canyon winds every night in the summer. It burned hot, and there's a desire to go back and plant trees there and restore it. But it's one of the most fire-prone kind of blowtorch places on the landscape we have. So maybe if you want to go plant trees, maybe you go plant them, at the bottom of a north-facing slope that has tall trees and shade. But everything about these maps can kind of give us clues about the reading the landscape and reading how the conditions that were there before led to the outcome that we got now. So I think it's kind of fascinating stuff. Let's see if we can check out the someone asked a question about the 3.9 fire, and just going to see if I can get an image for that while we're doing other stuff. And this imagery isn't just useful kind of right after the fire. It also can be useful, years down the road. So like for the Dixie fire, we've got some imagery, and maybe I'll cue that up, that looks at the severity patterns of Dixie. Kind of while we're on the satellite image tour, I'll jump over here to a pretty scary image. But I think really educational. We were talking about what drives fires, long-range spotting, and this is a map I made of the campfire right in the middle. So we just happened to have a satellite go over right in the middle of the disaster. And so here's Chico, here's Pulga, here's Paradise, and here's the campfire kind of entering Paradise right as, I think crazy thing about this image is that there's like thousands of people trapped in this image. And from space, it's just this interesting mix of colors, right? But in reality, there's thousands of people in this image in traffic jams, trying to get out the Skyway, driving through fire. You can see fire impinging on all the major roads out of town. But what's interesting to me about this is you see that the fire was spreading as hundreds of small fires, embers that started new fires, those fires started new fires themselves. And so we think of how fire spreads across the landscape, and this, I think, this is worth a million words, is that long-range spotting. So during this event, we had really dry conditions, and so really high probability of ignition. And we also had pine needles and black oak leaves, super dry. Every ember could start a new fire. So the fire itself that was burning a lot of these homes wasn't, in some places it was this firestorm. In other places it was just like fire cruising along with little flames through pine needles and oaks and then catching a house on fire because there was no firefighting going on, and because people had pine needles and oak leaves right up to the wood siding of their house. So this is one we talk about being ember aware and having the zone 0 of the first few feet off your house having nothing burnable, is because if a lot of folks out here had that zone 0 protection, these little fires that were spreading slowly out wouldn't have been able to catch their house on fire. So I was looking for severity imagery for Dixie. I jump here. I want to avoid making you all suffer through watching me browse my file system. So you can watch me run my computer instead. Half my job is just keeping files straight. There we go. Yeah. Yeah, sorry, not more prepared. I decided to sleep in a little this morning because it's getting up early for all y'all. It's awesome, but needed a break. Anthony Bracey says, Zeke, how you doing? I'm doing all right, man. I got to walk this morning. Just kind of, it's kind of running. Fire season. Here we go. Thanks for asking, man. And thanks, Mark, Sandy Bar Ranch. Ryan Kelper Stevens, he asked if some of the stuff that we see that looks green on the imagery might be dead later, might still die. And it happens for sure. A lot of trees that are especially drought stressed, they get burned hot around the base, and it can scorch the roots. A lot of places out here with these trees in places that haven't had fire for 100 years, the duff is so thick that the roots of the trees start to kind of grow up into this duff layer. And then in the past, that duff layer wouldn't have been so thick because we would have had frequent fire burning up through these pine stands. I saw some places with like dozer line through duff around Highway 44, and the duff was like 18 inches thick. So the roots start to grow in the layer, then we get a fire. When it's really dry, it burns the duff, it kills the roots. Tree looks green still because it just underburned, but then the tree dies. So coming in here, I want to talk just about Dixie, just to give you a sense of scale. Like this fire is 1 million acres, more if you count the Beckworth over here. But it burned over the course of, 10 weeks. During that course of that fire, we had all kinds, every weather condition you can imagine that would happen between July and September. So the fire started down here in the Feather River Canyon, and it burned a lot, fairly high severity kind of at the get-go. And there were times where there's islands that survived, but a lot of it burned hot. We were in drought. And then something interesting happened. The fire made a big run up the Feather River Canyon. It kind of burned from down here by Tobin all the way up kind of to Virgilia in the course of about a day and a half. When that happens on these big fires, it punches up a ton of smoke, enormous amount of smoke. And that tends to happen when we have a frontal passage. Unstable air, regional kind of big wind movement. And then what we know is that after we have a front that moves through, we almost always have stable high pressure weather system that sits in, right? So big run, huge amount of smoke, massive high severity, and then nothing. There's the smoke packed in, the fire laid down. And so wherever the fire happens to be when that happens, like here, the fire just laid down and then it backed down to the Humboldt Road here over the course of like probably a week. So this is like the last week of July. And so in the middle of this huge drought season, high severity, 1 million acre fire, we got this, week, 10 days of low severity fire. And this was a problem because basically Humboldt Road runs down through here from Butte Meadows up to Lake Almanor. And it's the only kind of major road through. There's Humboldt Road and Humbug Road. And other than that, the Feather River Canyon is, no place to really landscape scale control fire. We know that we've never really contained, once a fire's a couple thousand acres in the Feather River Canyon, we pick it up like at the top, Humboldt Road, Humbug Road. So Humboldt Road became this kind of major box for the fire, and they put a bunch of effort into prepping and firing this. And the problem was that we were in this strange week-long window of crazy high humidity, smoke, barely see anything. And so you can see that they did a big firing operation all the way from Lake Almanor basically to Butte Meadows. But the conditions weren't conducive to good consumption. It didn't get black enough. And then what happened is after about a week of being packed in, we got our crazy, unstable summer weather back. Smoke peeled out. The fire spotted here, spotted here, spotted here. And then it made this terrible run of over 100,000 acres in 2 days. It burned up like 50,000 acres of Collins Pine land. Sierra Pacific Industries took big losses. It almost burnt down the town of Chester. Same basic time period that blew up. Other part of the fire here blew up and destroyed Greenville. But all that's to say is just that we have, on a long fire like this, we get this wide range of effects. And those tell the story of the burning conditions. And they can give us some clues about what we might be able to get away with for prescribed fire conditions. There's this hesitation to burn in July, this hesitation to burn in August, because people say, oh, it's midsummer, you can't burn. It's as we've seen from the Klamath over the last 2 weeks, we've had an enormous amount of fire on the ground in August. Statistically, the worst time of the year to have fire, with beneficial effects across 70% of what's burned. So I think that we need to be flexible when we talk about using fire at scale. We need to be flexible about this idea that maybe we can burn in July, maybe we can burn in August, that these big fires are full of stories that give us these examples. They're also full of examples of this kind of terrible things that can happen when your August burn window turns into August firestorm window. But I think we need to keep in mind always the context is that this was happening at the end of an extended drought with insane kind of record-setting fuel moistures, lack of fuel moisture. And as we talked about the other day, that we have opportunities based on this now denuded landscape to put fire into adjacent areas that could look like this if they get a fire, but right now are safe places to apply prescribed fire at scale. Other interesting things that happened after this fire made its monster run was it kind of same thing. This run was crazy weather. It blasted north. We had a frontal passage. It blasted east. I'll see if I can find an image from that. It was just one of the craziest things I've ever seen weather-wise. And then it laid down, and it kind of took a couple weeks to burn out to Highway 821 here. And in the time then, you always, during that time, you'll have a few hours of strong south winds. You'll have a few hours of strong north winds, and you get these patches. Some of this is the result of firing operations. Some of this is just the result of past land management. Out here on Swain Mountain, as we talked about, pre-existing conditions are important. And so Swain Mountain was basically, it's an experimental forest for the Forest Service. And to be kind of rude and cynical, when you see an experimental forest on a map, that in the past that meant, let's see what happens if we throw all the rules out and log the shit out of this place. All right, so Swain Mountain, high elevation, they're like, whoa, what happens if you clear cut red fir and then burn all the slash and there's like 100 tons per acre and we just leave bare mineral soil? Well, then it's kind of a poor performing plantation and brush field for the next 50 years. And then a fire comes and it all gets nuked. So no offense to anyone who spent their career on the Almanor as a research forester, seeing what happens when you rape and pillage high elevation red fir. Did it for science, but that history has implications, and that implication in this case is that the places that didn't get the experimental treatment survived the Dixie Fire, and the places that did, almost, when I was, 5 years old or younger, they didn't. So, lessons learned. Anyway, it's pretty depressing. I grew up like right here. And so when I look at the Dixie, I look at like everything within 50 miles of where I grew up in three of the four directions, has really gone through it. So I guess, if you wonder why I'm motivated to talk about this stuff, it's because pretty much the entire landscape that I know best, where I've spent my career, has suffered enormously under all the different ways we've decided to try to manage it. And so if we can learn some lessons from that, if I can help further conversation about that, that's what we're all about, bringing that back home. Anyway, severity. And I think, emotional severity, emotional fire effects are part of the conversation. lots of just interesting stuff. I want to throw up another image here. We talk about, so this is the freelance fire lecture, right? You're along for the ride. I do need a syllabus, but I turn on a map and then I just, the stories tell themselves. Here's another story. I guess I also figure, just as a kind of in the big picture, it's fire season. Y'all are engaged in wanting to learn about fire. After it's raining hard for a few months and nothing's going on, there's going to be less appetite for talking about this. But while we're all fired up, no pun intended, might as well tell some stories, right? So this is like wildfire story hour. This is the Moonlight Fire. Had a great field trip out here with a forester named Ryan Hilburn, who I think I've had kind of a contentious relationship with forestry, and I've said some mean things about forestry at times, but people like Ryan have called me out and not let the stupid things I've said here and there keep us from talking. Keep it on talking. So Ryan took me out here, and we looked at some places on land that he manages that burned in the Dixie Fire and burned in the Moonlight Fire. So this is the Moonlight burn before the Dixie Fire. 65,000 acres burned hot. And then the Dixie burned it hot again. And a lot of work had been put into reforesting the Dixie Fire, or the Moonlight Fire. And a lot of that burned up. But also some of it survived. And so when I went out with Ryan, he showed me some plantations that they'd done that survived the fire. And there's a great conversation going on about reforestation. You look at the Dixie and there's kind of this like, how are we going to reforest it all? And then there's this other conversation that's like, well, why should we? And the Moonlight has some good, because you look at Moonlight burned in 2007, it burned 14 years later in Dixie. It didn't slow it down, really. I mean, it did slow it down, but it didn't stop it. And so when you look at this whole landscape, a lot of the private timberland out here is being salvaged, logged, and replanted. But before we rush and replant a lot of this stuff, I think it's worth asking, do we have the capacity to actually manage this future forest? The Forest Service has got a terrible track record of, they plant a bunch of trees after fire and then they walk away, and then those plantations burn in the next fire. So what it takes to actually reforest and have that not die, in Beatty's case here, was clear cut the dead trees, herbicide, rip with a dozer, rip all the slash in the ground, herbicide the brush until it's all dead, plant your trees. And in this case, they planted them farther apart than they normally would have. Control the brush with herbicide, and then some of their trees survived. Dixie. So what the Forest Service did after Dixie after Moonlight is they came in here and they planted a bunch of trees, and they didn't do anything really. They didn't control the brush, and they didn't thin the trees, and they planted them. They all got nuked, basically. Anyway, lessons learned. A lot of hard lessons learned. A lot of foresters have put a huge amount of effort in their careers into reforesting this land. As you can see here, before the Dixie, this is all the private land that had been reforested, and you can see it's wider spaced, and there's no brush, right? And then you can see like where the public land begins, there's a ton of brush. And so the difference between this and this is this got ripped with a cat, planted, and herbicided heavily. And so that's part of the conversation. If you want to reforest burnt timberlands in fire-prone landscapes, a lot of the times that means heavy application of herbicides to kill the brush. A lot of people don't like herbicides at all, and this is kind of the question is, well, what do you want it to look like? How long are you all right with it taking 200 years to be forest again? Are you all right with it not being forest again? And if you go the industrial timber route, how much of that is going to survive the next Dixie Fire? And this imagery doesn't really show it very well. I've got other stuff we can bring up on a future talk. We shot a lot of photos out here when I was out there with Ryan. So a lot of subtlety to how we are going to kind of deal with the aftermath of these fires, but a lot of lessons to learn in fires like Moonlight that burned again afterwards. So one thing I wanted to talk about here is just this is a kind of interesting spot on the landscape to talk about fire history and fire regime. And so if you look at these, if you fly over this part of the landscape, we're around Susanville here, you see all these fires that run this direction. They run from the southwest to the northeast. That just tells you that that's when we have fires out here, is when we have a strong southwest wind, which is the prevailing kind of summer afternoon wind. Fires burn downwind. So each place has this kind of story. And so on the kind of east side, you see a lot of that, like up here around Bieber, Bernie, all these little skinny fires. And each place kind of has that story. And what that tells you, and oftentimes, is like, well, if you're going to build a fuel break in this country, you probably don't want to build it like from the southeast to the northwest, because the fire is going to jump over it. But maybe you want to build one that runs southwest to northeast, because then you can use it to kind of flank a fire into it. But every place on the landscape has their story. You've got Southern California's got its fires that burn with Santa Ana winds, and Northeastern California, your fires are shaped like feathers and point to the northeast. And that's just and then maybe a lot of these fires are lightning fires that start on the tops of hills and back down and kind of retain more of a kind of round shape. But when you interpret this fire history, it can tell you a lot about there's just stories. Every single one of these fires, I think what I trip out on is I look at this map of fire history, and I think that, man, like hotshot crews, inmate crews, dozers, like someone had to go out and put a line around every single one of these fires you see. And it's just this kind of, it sums up this crazy amount of labor and resource expenditure and everything else that's gone into every single one of these being contained. You know, when we start talking about thousands and thousands and thousands of them. Gary Roberts asks, what herbicide is used? Agent Orange Light. Herbicides, man. So I grew up in kind of an activist family, right? My dad was anti-herbicide activist. He moved from Berkeley to Westwood, and in 1979, and they were spraying Agent Orange on plantations on the Almanor and 2,4-D. Talking to folks from the Forest Service that worked in that time, they said, like there was all this Agent Orange left after Vietnam. So they gave it to the Forest Service, and then all these Forest Service folks mixed it up and used helicopters to spray it on all these plantations. And so let's bring up, it's great that Google Earth has this imagery post-Dixie Fire, but I kind of want to see what it looked like, before that. So many stories. So the Almanor National Forest, it's kind of mixed here, but the Almanor comes out here. And the Almanor is one of those places where they logged it super heavily. It's just like the Forest Service in general. They logged super heavily kind of from the 50s, 60s, 70s. In the 80s, they were keeping it up. 90s, it got shut down because of the spotted owl, and the whole thing just kind of turned off like a light switch. But the Almanor, they did a ton of clear cuts, and then these clear cuts belonged to someone else. But the Almanor itself, they had this real patchwork of clear cuts, and they high graded all the big trees, and a lot of this forest just got super worked over. And so then they did a ton of herbicide to reforest. So it's kind of like huge amount of work. So like plantations like this, turns out you cut all the trees down, and if there's brush there already, it comes back in heavy brush, and you plant your trees and they get outcompeted by the brush and they don't thrive. So the Almanor spent a huge amount of energy on controlling brush in their plantations. They didn't spend much energy on thinning their plantations where they'd planted too many trees to start with, And so then the Dixie Fire pretty much devastated the entire the Dixie Fire just wiped out the almanor, right? Like, look at all that work, all that herbicide they used, all the planting, all the stand exams, everything else, and that whole almanor basin for the almanor just got wiped out. So anyway, to go back to my folks, when we moved to Westwood, there's a lot of spraying going on the timberlands, Forest Service timberlands, and people are getting sick. We had friends who were eating a lot of fish out of Lake Almanor and then had birth defects. And people all over Northern California were really alarmed about Agent Orange being sprayed on Forest Service plantations. And so there were a lot of campaigns spread out from people from Westwood to Hay Fork to High and Palm to Salmon River of people getting kind of involved in forest activism around anti-herbicide campaigns. And so in Lassen County, they tried to pass an ordinance. My dad went around door to door with a petition to get the Forest Service banned from using Agent Orange and 2,4-D. Kind of built it built an activist community around forestry. And now it's still going on, the herbicide spraying, the herbicide argument. And it's just, I don't have an answer to any of that. I see both sides. I see that herbicides are important if you want to reforest in areas with brush. And I also don't like the idea of, I don't like herbicides. And I know a lot of foresters that have, gotten sick. A lot of foresters got cancer and you can't say it's because they tromped around out there in herbicide, but it's delicate. And it's part of the conversation for sure. And we'll try to cover it. I got really one of my best friends he's been working as an industrial forester, and we talk a lot about this. And he says, when you look at the amount of herbicide used in agriculture per acre every year, forestry applying herbicide once or twice in a 50-year rotation is, if you really want to be, he says, if you really want to be, involved in reducing toxic herbicide pollution, you should look at agriculture where they spray multiple times every season on the same ground year after year after year. And I think that's a good point. It is, I don't think many people feel that good about dumping a bunch of poison on the ground and the rivers that are the water for the entire state. But there you go. It's complicated. I'll take a breath here. Ryan's wondering if I'm going to burn down the lookout. There's a question if I've covered the 3.9 fire yet. I have not, but it was one of the only fires that got flown last night with infrared. It'll take me a minute to cue that up. Man. Someone said something about Bogard. So we got a story on our website about firing operations. There were some, I encourage you to go check it out. This road here, the 10 road, was kind of the line that was going to be the Dixie Fire, kind of hold the line here. Originally on the Dixie Fire, the plan was to hold it at Highway 44, just because they didn't, I think they had the resources to prep the 10 road all the way around here. And then you see that there's a bunch of private timberland out in here, and they were not game at all to have their, and rightfully so, to have their clear cuts inside the box of what was going to get burned. So a bunch of effort went into holding the 10 road. And there was a firing operation out here on the 10 road that kind of got pushed. You can see that the fire skunked around out here with this low severity. And then we had a forecast for strong southwest winds. And you can see that the fire made the run. And so out ahead of that wind event, they kind of got rushed into firing this. And then they couldn't hold it. And it became an additional part of burn, and a lot of energy went into chasing it. You can still see some heat in there when this image is done. But what I think is interesting about that is that this big wind event that came, it actually stopped before the fire got to the road that they'd fired. But in the process, we moved the fire ahead. So the fire was out here. We did a firing operation. Wind event came. Our firing operation fire spread 2 miles. The fire that was coming up the road spread 2 miles. Never got to the road. But in the meantime, we moved the whole front of the fire forward, and so all this land got burned in the same wind event. And you never know, But what I like to think about with this is that every wind event is kind of got a set duration. And so if you expect a one-day wind event, maybe you're going to get 3 miles of fire spread. And it's hard to tell. Maybe you're going to get 5 because you get a spot. But that happened many times on the Dixie where our firing operation advanced the fire ahead of where it would have gotten to if we had just not done anything. But on the other hand, when this made its run, it could have spotted all over the place. It's just at this scale, firefighting is really almost impossible. This is also, they tried to fire out in here. This happened. But another part of Dixie that was really interesting was that they tried to fire out in here in a burn that was 7 years old, and they couldn't get it to burn because it's green brush. Anyway, someone asked about 3.9 fire, so we'll go over there. Turn off our Dixie party. See what I got here. There we go. There we go, 3.9 fire. Okay, so 3.9. It's kind of continuing, the 3.9 is kind of continuing to burn up to the top of the South Fork Mountain. It hasn't spread much to the south since the day before. So there's a bunch of heat on it. There's nothing really active kind of to the north end of that, but it's spreading up. I wanted to cover the fire in the Tyee Creek, the Tyee Ridge fire too, but we don't really have any new intel on that or the other Oregon fires. So, but that's the answer to 3.9 question. Any other questions? So Wildfire 371 says there's a history on the Lassen of firing at the wrong time of day, usually by non-local fire folks. There are times during each fire season that tricks even the best ops folks. For sure. Yeah, I'd love to talk with you about that, or anyone ever wants to get a hold of me and tell stories or talk about stuff you want us to cover on here, just get a hold of us. TheLookout.org. There's a link there. We've seen the same thing on the Plumas, with Southern California Cal Fire team lighting off the ridge above Concow. When the locals said, "Hey, the wind blows down canyon every night," and then the backfire became a fire that burned the whole Concow Basin. So one thing we didn't talk about, but that's happening right now on the Klamath, is that we're 2 weeks into the management of these fires, and so the teams are timing out, and they're all going home. And so we've got new teams coming in. I'm not sure where those teams are from, but they're not up to speed with the strategy. They're not up to speed with what's been happening necessarily. And oftentimes we see bad things happen during team transition. These folks are lucky that they're coming in on a rainstorm. Sometimes a team comes in on a wind event, and so you got a whole new set of kind of people in charge who inherit this crazy mess that they don't really understand. And it's just one of those things about these big fires that kind of defies management, is that, people need to sleep. You need to give people time off. it's pretty hard. You know, the Dixie Fire, there were folks that were out for 45 days straight. Anyway, appreciate all the expertise in the comments and the stories, and we'll keep putting these together. We'll try to get a little more organized. We're definitely just running on fumes and pulling it out thin air, but appreciate your interest. Am I missing anything, Ryan? I feel like I need an earbud with Ryan in my ear to tell me, hey, it's not on. Looks like we're good. Okay, thanks everyone.